All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to start chapter 14, which I just call life lesson. So in this chapter, I'm basically just going to talk about some interesting stuff that I learned over the years since I started. Basically, I charge my subconscious every day. I use it for everything, right? So I'm always focused on what's going on in my subconscious mind, and I'm charging it for different things. I even still experiment with different things. Right, I'm not really developing the theory as much these days. I still know, to be fair, I still am, just not in terms of subconscious control. Now I develop them in terms of spirituality and metaphysics, which we're going to talk about in book 2. But yeah, when I first started learning how to control my subconscious, there were a lot of things I learned, kind of just about life, that I wanted to talk about in this chapter. There's not going to be a lot of hard theory in this chapter. It's really just, like I said, interesting things I learned about when I started controlling my subconscious. What I will say is what we're going to talk about in this video actually is very important. So this is actually very important theory that is going to be important to what we talk about in book 2 when it comes to spirituality and the laws of metaphysics. So this video is very important. But I think a lot of what we talk about the rest of the chapters is going to be just interesting things I learned, maybe not super consequential to what we learned in book 2. And then later I'm going to talk about how I basically cured my anxiety and depression and sleep anxiety disorder through these principles, right? I charged my subconscious in a way that just changed my body. So I'm going to talk about that later. That's actually not in the book. I don't know if I'll cover everything in this chapter that's in the book, but we'll see. So for now, I want to talk about what I call the pleasure problem, right? So, let me just go over this first point, right? So basically what I'm going to talk about here is what I learned about when I first started learning how to control my subconscious. I just started charging for the purpose of feeling really good all the time, right? To go over this first point, it says charging for emotional euphoria eventually leads to a feeling of emptiness, right? So that's ultimately what I learned. And so to kind of explain that, let me just say that when I first started learning this, or actually before I did, I kind of thought, before I learned how to control my subconscious, right? I kind of thought about joy and happiness and pleasure kind of the same way most people, I think, do. We've all been kind of bred and raised in society. And these kind of ideas, these kind of ideals have been internalized within us, right? That ultimately pleasure or happiness really comes from money, right? So happiness really comes from money through its ability to allow us to manipulate and change the external reality to circumstances that we feel favor us, right? And if we can change this aspect of reality and this aspect and this aspect, then that will allow us to feel really, really good, right? So in other words, there's this idea that joy and happiness is a function of what's going on in the external environment around you, right? So I kind of had that belief. I think we've all been, at least here in America, we've all been sort of raised to have that belief, right? Maybe no one directly told us, but it's kind of been beaten into us, in many different ways from things we observe and things we interact with and observe within our culture. But when I started learning about the subconscious, I learned that wasn't true, right? So happiness and pleasure are actually a function of your intention. Now, to be fair, it's more a function of your relationship with God. We're going to talk about that later. That's where happiness really comes from. But that's a more deeply metaphysical truth. So for now, we're just going to talk about it in a more secular way. And we're going to say that happiness is just an emotion or pleasure or joy, right? It's just an emotion. And any emotion is actually a function of your intention, right? Because your subconscious is quantized by intention. And emotions come from your subconscious. So in other words, once I learned those principles, I kind of started applying them in my life, right? So it was almost like a shortcut in a way. So all this time I've been raised to believe that I needed to do all this stuff and give all this effort, right, to change the environment around me so that I could finally be like happy and experience joy. Then I realized, no, right, I can cut all of that out and just skip to where it actually matters, which is my intention, the relationship between my intention and subconscious. And so then I just started using my knowledge I started controlling my subconscious to just charge huge amounts of emotional pleasure And I would deep charge like crazy to reach the highest levels of emotional euphoria or emotional intensity. I don't want to use the term happiness because that's a broader term, which we're going to talk about later in the video. But for now, I'll just say I reached emotional euphoria. So I felt really, really good because I felt such high levels of emotional pleasure, of a positive emotion, right? Just think of it as being in such an amazing mood that you just feel wonderful all the time, right? But so when I first started learning this stuff, I started doing that naturally because I'm like, well, isn't that kind of what we're supposed to do? Seek the highest pleasure and joy, right? And so you kind of, it's like there's an internal sort of unspoken rule that our goal in life is just to seek the highest forms of pleasure and the highest forms of happiness. We're going to talk about the purpose of life in book 2, but I feel like that's just another thing that's been beaten into us, that the goal in life is always to seek the highest form of happiness and pleasure, and the key is to do that through money, right? But I had the idea that the highest goal in life is to seek happiness and pleasure, but the key to doing that is through your subconscious. So that's kind of how my thinking changed. And so I just started charging my subconscious to reach huge levels or hugely intense levels of euphoria. But eventually, I started to realize this truth, right? Because I started to feel empty in a certain kind of way. Now, in other words, it's bad. The ultimate truth that I learned is it's bad to feel too good all the time, or to feel really, really good and kind of stay there. Now, why is it bad, right? Because that's kind of a strange thing to say, right? It's like our goal is to try to feel good all the time. Why would it be a bad thing to finally achieve that? Well, before I give the answer, let me just say two things that it's not, right? And I feel these distinctions or these caveats are important, and I make it in the book too. So for one, it wasn't because charging these feelings eventually got old to me. That didn't happen at all, right? So we talked about that in chapter 9 and 10, right? So that's subconscious entropy. The reason we're able to charge energy is specifically because we learned how to prevent things from getting old. So we can only do it because we got around that problem, right? So charging emotional pleasure or charging for emotional euphoria never got old to me. It felt amazing, right? I would probably still do it all the time. Sometimes I feel like I would do it forever, right? If it weren't for the problem that it eventually leads to, right? So it definitely didn't get old. And also, it wasn't like my body started having problems with it. Like, when people take drugs and they use that for a kind of euphoria and pleasure, right, it has a terrible effect on their body, which leads to terrible effects on their mood and everything, right? So that didn't happen. That didn't happen either, right? Actually, when you deep charge positive frequencies, your body responds better, right? And so I felt really good, and I felt good physically. My body didn't have, as far as I know, it didn't have any problems, right? But then, if it doesn't get old and your body doesn't get addicted and your body responds fine, what could possibly be bad about feeling too good all the time? Well, what I eventually realized, there were two things that I noticed happening to me when I started to deep charge because I never really did that before, right? I'm like most people, I kind of experience reality through the lens of the unique condition of things being new to me and occasionally experiencing the shock charge effect. When something is apparently looks apparently new to the subconscious, even though it actually isn't. And so once I learned the more general rule of how the subconscious behaves in the post-new phase of something you're focused on, I just started charging to reach super high levels, and like I said, that was a whole new world to me. And as I did that more and more and more, there was a change within me that I started to notice that wasn't really good. So first, I started to notice that I wasn't challenging myself, like, at all, right? And there were many things in my life that I needed to fix, between money, relationship problems, work. Like, there were things that I needed to work on. There were goals I needed to reach, right? But I just had no motivation to do so, right? Actually, to go over this point, it says, too intense a positive frequency charge alters one's perception in a way that demotivates them, right? So I just felt no motivation to really fight for anything, right? To go hard to try to achieve some goal, right? And the reason for that was because I felt so good all the time. There was no reason to, right? So remember what I said, your subconscious, when it charges, it alters your perception in some way, in a way that reflects the frequency of the charge. And because I was charging subconscious energy to reach really intense levels of euphoria, I was so happy that my perception was charged to really perceive the world in a happy way. So in other words, the world just looked like sunshine and rainbows to me, right? It didn't matter who was suffering, right? What problems I had. And this is actually a similar effect to what happens when people take drugs, right? In that case, their body just gets hugely damaged in the process. So it didn't happen for me. My body actually responded better, but that particular effect was ultimately still the same, right? So much, the world looked so wonderful to me, regardless of what problems it had, right? So a person could have been suffering, I could be suffering, my life could be terrible, could be all these problems, but none of it really mattered because all of it still looked wonderful and like it wasn't that big a deal because my perception was too altered. So I actually talked about that in previous chapters, I think chapter 3 and 9, I think, one of them. I was saying how when your subconscious charges too much, no, I think chapter 10. Yeah, I was thinking chapter 10 when I talk about positive memory. But anyway, I was saying how when your subconscious charges too much, your perception can become so altered that it actually becomes unhealthy, right? You need your negative mind to keep you grounded, right? So too much positive memory is a bad thing, just like too much negative memory, at least in your short-term subconscious memory. Too much negative memory is a bad thing. It has to be a proper balance, right? It should be a little bit more positive than negative, but you want a balance. So in this case, it was too much positive memory, right? It altered my perception too much, and I couldn't properly interact in society and sort of change my life in a positive way, right? I was just thinking in too kind of diluted a way, and the world looked too much like sunshine and rainbows. And the reason, and ultimately that really comes from another consequence, right? So remember what I said about deep charging, right? So to deep charge the subconscious, you have to keep producing intentions, right? Not only related to the frequency of the charge you want, but you have to keep producing intentions that keep storing positive memories with a positive subconscious frequency in your short-term memory. In other words, you want to keep having positive experiences throughout a rolling 7-day period, because all those positive experiences get added to your short-term memory and they give a boost to your deep charge because it's also a positive frequency. The more negative experiences you have, the more that means you are producing a negative intention at some point, and that stores negative energy in your short-term memory, and that dampens, it weighs down your ability to deep charge higher positive emotions. So, which I knew these principles at the time. So what I started doing was I started going really hard to avoid anything that felt like a challenge, or not just any negative experience, but anything that felt like a challenge. Because when you experience a challenge, right, or something, and I didn't really know I was doing this at the time, I was just applying these principles. I didn't mean to kind of have this outcome, but that's how I learned of this, right? I was just kind of avoiding difficult situations because I didn't want to produce an intention that I knew was going to get stored in my short-term memory and dampen my ability to reach the highest levels of emotion euphoria. So I just completely stopped challenging myself. I stopped doing anything that was a little bit difficult to avoid producing a negative intention. And I just started only doing things that felt good and pleasurable and were easy, right? And it did work exactly the way I theoretically predicted it would. So it allowed me to reach really high levels, so really intense levels of emotional euphoria because I just deep charged it so perfectly, right? There was nothing but positive memory in my short-term memory. But the problem with that is that, once again, it was bad for me to not seek challenges, right? And that's why, really, I had to avoid challenges to actually reach that high level of emotional euphoria, right? So that really plays into what I was saying about how, I just became demotivated. I just didn't want to face any challenge. I actually was intentionally avoiding them in favor of reaching higher levels of emotional intensity. And what I also noticed was that when I finally would get in a difficult situation, sometimes when I had no choice, that's just how life is. Sometimes you just kind of have to step up and kind of challenge yourself. I noticed that I was so not used to it at that point, right, that it actually started to look new to my subconscious again. So we talked about this in the section on shock charging, right? I was so used to putting myself in easy circumstances that when I finally had to or in a difficult circumstance, I shock charge all the sort of negative emotions that come with that. Any feeling of it being difficult or hard, or sometimes you have anxiety, I shock charge all of that. Right? So the combination of that, plus if it gave me anxiety, my body would charge it too. And so even though I had this intense emotional euphoria charge, right, between shock charging and charging for my body, there would still be circumstances where I would feel anxiety from challenging myself or putting myself in some challenging situation. And so I would feel it so strongly, then that didn't feel good, right? So I would try to avoid it more, right, and then go back to charging this. So it's like kind of a vicious cycle. I would just keep trying to stick to emotional euphoria to kind of feel good about life and feel good about reality. And it did work for the most part, right? I felt good all the time. Even though I had those little circumstances where, I would feel difficulty and I wouldn't feel so good, they were rare enough where it's like, this was still worth it, right? But really, in the end, when I started to realize that I just something didn't feel right? Even though I felt really good, something was off at the same time. Something that just kind of felt like, it was like almost a feeling of emptiness, which is weird, right? Despite how good I felt, I also felt a little empty at the same time. Again, this is also something that people experience when they use drugs, right? Now, the proper way to do this, right, has to do with the more broader, like I said this earlier, but I'll just say it again. It has to do with the more broader nature of happiness and joy, which actually comes from God, right? So when you're seeking true happiness, right, you would actually do that through your relationship with God. But I didn't know that at the time. Well, yeah, I didn't know it at the time the way I do now. But so that's kind of why this can happen. While even though you feel a huge amount of pleasure, you feel empty too. And so what I realized is that there are actually two kinds of pleasure, right? So when I felt that sense of emptiness and I kept focusing on all these things in my life that I needed to change and I wasn't fighting for, I wasn't working hard to achieve, I realized that true happiness, to reach a true state of happiness, I have to fight for something, right? I have to actually work hard to achieve some goal or outcome. That's what I stopped doing, and that's when, even though I was feeling more intense pleasure, I started feeling greater emptiness at the same time. And that's because I completely stopped fighting for anything. So I realized that real happiness comes from actually a mixture of the two. It comes from just experiencing certain types of pleasure, but also actually working hard to achieve stuff, right? And in the book, I think I use the terms easy pleasure and hard pleasure, which are terrible names, but I didn't really know what to call it. What I'm going to talk about in a moment, between pleasure and purpose, is really the more proper terminology, I think. But for the moment, I learned that and I think Epicurus says the same thing. I don't know how to properly pronounce it. I'm going to say Epicurus, that's how I always pronounce it. He's an ancient Greek philosopher who talked about three types of pleasure. I think he talked about pleasure that's personal, but is, I forgot it. It's like pleasure that's personal, but isn't like out of control. And then there's pleasure that can never be satisfied. And those are two. I forgot what the other one was. But it's something like that. I could look it up. But I remember reading about it and thinking that what he said is similar to what I say. But I just put it in more subconscious terms. So I learned that easy pleasure are pleasures that are just for you and require no work to obtain, right? Now, when I say no work to obtain, I'm not necessarily talking about, let's say you want to buy a new car, right? And you want it solely because you like the way the car looks. It's super nice. You already have a car. It works perfectly fine. Gets you to where you want to go. But you want a really nice car. Let's say a BMW, right? That's actually an example of an easy pleasure. So in spite of how much effort it might take for the average person to get the car, that would still be considered an easy pleasure because once you have the money, you can just get the car, and then just driving the car and kind of stunning around others, that's the pleasure. That's the joy, right? Like eating good foods or sex, things like that. Those are easy forms of pleasure. So what is a hard pleasure? Well, a hard pleasure there's certain types of joy that you can only feel if you worked really hard to achieve it, right? And so the way I like to think of it is very similar to quantum mechanics, right? So in quantum mechanics, we actually talked about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? Which says you can only know the position and momentum of a quantum particle within a certain degree of accuracy. You can't know both below a certain degree of accuracy, which would be h bar over 2. I think we talked about it before. And so some students will think like, oh, well, that's because we don't have a good enough measuring device, right? If we just had a good enough measuring device, then we can know both position and momentum beneath a certain degree of uncertainty, I should say. But no, right? Then teachers will tell them, no, this has nothing to do with our measuring device or the instrument we're using. It's actually just a fundamental truth of nature, right? And it's actually a consequence of the Fourier transform, I believe. And really what it comes down to is that the wave nature of particles, right, is too expressed at the quantum level, right? You could all matter has particle-like nature and a wave-like nature, right? You could completely ignore the wave-like nature for macroscopic particles. That's why you can give them a precise momentum and a precise position. It's also why you can use a sort of force diagram to model their behavior and set up an equation of motion. However, at the quantum level, the wave nature is too strongly expressed, right? And a wave doesn't really have a precise position, right? And so at the quantum level, the wave nature gets in the way too much, and it doesn't allow you to know the position and momentum beneath a certain degree of certainty. And so that's a fundamental law built into nature. There's nothing we can do about it. So it's kind of the same way here, right? When it comes to hard pleasures, which ultimately leads to purpose, but for now we'll just say hard pleasures. It has nothing to do with how much money you have, how much power you have, how much control you have in reality, right? How many people listen to you is irrelevant, right? You cannot feel this type of pleasure unless you worked hard to achieve it, right? And this is something that sort of people who get rich or dictators, people who are kings or people who rule countries, they experience this. Because when you have too much power, right, there starts to be an emptiness to it because now everything's an easy pleasure. People keep thinking that real happiness results from getting the easy pleasure so they don't have to work anymore. They didn't realize that the work itself provided a certain type of pleasure that your spirit needs. But really, to go into it, let's say that you have to work really hard to win a sports game, right? You want to play a sport, let's say it's your rival team, right? Your rival opponent, you hate them, you want to, right? You never want to lose to them, and you work really hard all season to defeat them. And then during the game, you're working hard, it's close, but in the end, you end up beating them, right? Let's say you beat them at the last second, right? It's touch and go for a moment. You shoot it, let's say it's basketball, you shoot a 3-point shot at the last minute, at the buzzer, and then you beat them. There's a certain kind of joy you feel in that moment because of how hard you worked, right? If you beat them too easily, you wouldn't really feel that much joy, right? Sometimes the joy is because of the effort you put into winning. That's why when people get really good at something, they want to challenge, right? They don't want to just keep beating people all easily because that's a form of easy pleasure. That's not a hard pleasure. If they keep beating people in terms of the easy pleasure too easily, then they experience the same emptiness problem, right? Because real pleasure or real happiness is actually a mixture of easy pleasure and hard pleasures. Eventually, while easy pleasures might cause them to be happy for a while, a little bit of time, eventually they're going to need a hard pleasure, right? So they're going to start to feel empty unless they get that hard pleasure. So that's why they want a challenge. They want someone to challenge them so they can feel the joy of winning while only because they worked really hard. So it's the same thing if you study for a test, right? If you study for a test in class, if it's too easy, you won't really feel a certain type of joy, right? But if you studied like crazy and you worked really hard to pass this test and you find out you passed or you got an A, there's a certain type of joy. You feel proud of yourself. There's a certain type of joy that you feel because you know how hard you worked to earn that A, right? Now, technically, I could just charge some story in my mind. I could just charge it to say, oh, I beat these opponents. And even though I really didn't in life, I could just charge it anyway to sort of alter my perceptions, perceive it if I want to. I could charge a feeling like I passed some test or whatever. And I can do those things that way too. But I'll never be quite convinced on the subconscious level that it's real, right? I probably could do that if I didn't have to interact with the world around me, but that's the point. You would have to retreat from the world around you to live inside your mind if you tried to do something like that. You live in this world, right? And you want to interact with this world in a way where you make changes that allow you to feel good, right? Authentically, not just in an imaginary way. Imagination's good too, but it's not the only thing, right? You don't want to retreat from life so that you feel good. And what it ultimately comes down to is that there are two types of pleasure. There's two types of happiness, right? Really, I should say happiness, or two qualities to happiness. One of them is, and I'll use different terms now, one of them is pleasure, right? Which is what I refer to as easy pleasures, right? It's just feeling good solely for yourself. It has nothing to do with working hard. You just want to feel good. That's what I was doing when I was charging for emotional intensity. The other type of pleasure is what I actually now call purpose. What hard pleasures really come down to is, and there are different type of pleasure, but what they really come down to is the feeling of purpose, right? What you actually want is you want to have a purpose and pursue some purpose, right? The joy that you feel in pursuing a purpose and achieving it it's something that I have learned your spirit actually needs. Like, your spirit actually won't be happy, it won't feel complete unless you have both kinds of happiness. And the reason why that is, it has to do with what I said before, I'll say it again, it has to do with the more broader nature of how happiness works, which more accurately just represents your relationship with God and acting in alignment with His will. And it is His will for you to pursue purpose, right? But again, we'll talk about that later, but for now, just know that happiness is actually a balancing act. It's not a destination. So that's I think that's a big misconception in our society about happiness, is we don't perceive happiness in a proper way as a relationship with God. It's been beaten into our minds that happiness is a function of what's happening in the external world around us, and because of that, we want to have as much money as we can because that's the best way to change the external world around us. But that actually isn't how happiness works. Happiness is a function of the spirit, which includes your intention, and your spirit is made that you will only feel happy if you have both of these in the proper amounts, right? If you spend too much time focusing on pleasure, right, so you're not working hard enough toward any purpose, eventually, let's say any form of happiness that you did have from purpose is going to discharge, right? It's going to discharge the more you focus on pleasure, and even though you're feeling more pleasure, the part of your spirit that needs purpose is going to that energy is going to discharge, and now you're going to need it more. So you're going to be, as it discharges more and more, your spirit wants it more and more, and that feeling of wanting eventually becomes unhealthy, and you start to feel empty, and you start to feel like a void because you're ignoring that part of your spirit that's calling you to pursue purpose, right? And if you pursue too much purpose, you will feel happiness in a certain kind of way, but then you're going to start to feel empty in terms of pleasure. So that can happen when people work too hard, right? When they just work nonstop, they work like maybe 16 hours a day, all they do is pay bills, so that they have purpose. They're sort of taking care of all these things in their life that they need, but they experience no pleasure. There's no joy in it, right? And so now they feel a different kind of void, right? So you need both, right? That's why you want to work hard, but you don't want to work too hard, right? You have to have the proper balance of the two, right? And when you have the proper balance of the two, then you actually feel happy. You feel truly happy, right? And that's what I learned. And so when I learned that, I stopped just charging. I don't even do it anymore, right? Because there's no point in doing it. I know that's not real happiness. I stopped charging to try to reach the highest levels of emotional intensity. Then I learned how important purpose was, right? And so I stopped. There will be times when you pursue purpose, you're not going to be able to reach higher levels of intensity because you're going to be pushing yourself in difficult situations, right? So when you're in difficult circumstances, you will no doubt produce intentions that are going to dampen your ability to charge high frequencies. The way your body responds, so I used to do it too. I would work like crazy, right, to achieve certain goals. I talk about that in the book too when I talk about, actually I think that might be in the next video. No, I think it's the video after next. I talk about transcendental productivity, which is something I learned from working like crazy. So all that work, when I'm working all day, all those thoughts related to work, which aren't super stressful, but they're not really enjoyable, right? They all get saved to short-term memory, and they weigh down my ability to reach higher levels of charge, at least charging levels of euphoria for emotional intensity, right? And then when I just have all these thoughts like, oh, I don't feel like going to work, or if I'm staying up really late and I'm really tired, but I'm working anyway, I'm stressed, all those things are going to prevent you from reaching higher levels of emotional intensity, but at least in terms of euphoria, but they are going to make your spirit, they're going to satisfy your spirit's need for purpose. So you're still going to be happy, but in a different type of way. So that's what I learned. So I completely stopped. I now kind of focus on doing both in the proper balance, right? So I make sure to have enough purpose, but also have enough pleasure. Getting the pleasure part super easy because I just know how to charge it. So, but I do it in the proper balance, and when you have the proper balance, now you're truly happy. One thing I kind of talk about, I think I mentioned in the book, is like older people. Sometimes you'll see older people who, especially if they're like rich, they don't want to stop working. Why don't you're like, well, if you could stop working, if you have all this money, just stop, right? Retire and enjoy yourself. Part of the reason they don't do that is because when they stop, then if they're not pursuing purpose, they discharge that type of happiness, and the spirit just starts to feel more empty again. And it's like, it's almost like a burden at sometimes, right? I won't say a burden, it is part of the purpose of life. However, I think when you get really old, I kind of wondered one time, does this go away when you get really old? Because you kind of don't have the vitality anymore to work hard to pursue purpose. But I think based on what I've seen, it still happens even in older people, right? So if you go to like the old folks' homes, I forget what the actual name is, the senior homes, you'll see there's almost a kind of lifelessness to them, right? Not only because they're close to the end, but they're not pursuing any purpose, right? And it creates that void in them, right? Because their spirit, that part of your spirit never changes. Even if you're 99 years old, that part of your spirit still needs, because your spirit is ageless, right? Your body ages, but your spirit is the same all the time, and it still needs purpose. And if you're not pursuing purpose, then the happiness-based purpose that you discharges, and as it discharges more and more, you feel more and more of a void. So that's basically what I want to talk about in this video, called The Pleasure Problem. Ultimately, the truth that I realized about the nature of our spirit, is that we need two types of pleasure to be happy, and true happiness is a balancing act. It's not a destination. There is no point you can ever reach where you're officially happy, and you don't have to worry again, right? That's how movies work. But in reality, it's not like that. Energy is constantly changing, right? And happiness is really a balancing act between the two types of happiness, and really a balancing act in your subconscious energy. The moment it gets out of balance, you're going to feel a void and be unhappy, and in one way related to these two. Now, really, unhappiness, the more broad way, has to do with your relationship with God. The further you move away from God, the more unhappy you're going to be. But for now, we'll just kind of use this framework, which is the incomplete framework, but we can use it for now, and just say that if these get out of balance, then you're going to be unhappy, period. You have to keep them balanced. And happiness, like I said, is really a balancing act and not a destination. So that's it for the video. This is very important. Right, this is going to be very important for things we talked about in book 2. But this is just something I learned about happiness that I wanted to talk about with you guys. So, if you want to even try this, you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. The more you keep trying to deep charge and reach higher levels of emotional intensity, you can only do it if you stop challenging yourself. So you're going to notice this feeling of emptiness sort of occur more and more and more, right? In the next video, what's in the next video? I think I talk about healing through negative memory. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how healing works. How negative memory basically helps you to heal. But yeah, that's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.